Hello, everyone. In the wake of Columbus's voyage, numerous Spaniards followed in his journey, including Hernán Cortés. Now, Cortés descended from nobility. His father was a hidalgo, a member of a lesser nobility. And for the Spain of Cortés, hidalgos were a overpopulated class of which not much could be achieved in Spain. The only real route to achieve honor and fame for Cortés, important things for Hidalgo, were one of two options. Either fight in one of the wars going on at that time in Italy, or go to the West, go to the Indies, where there were now rumors floating of untold promises of wealth. And numerous Spaniards flocked to the West based on this idea, not on any real fixed income or guarantee of fixed income, but based on hopes and promises that the cost in the end would be worth it. But moreover, Cortés was inspired by classical history in much the same way Columbus was. And historians argue that there are so many instances in which you can see classical influences on Cortés. Before his departure for the American hemisphere in 1504, historians think that Cortés most likely read Caesar's commentaries, because one of the battlefield commands which Cortés issued his troops, his Spanish conquistadors, resembled a significantly older command given by Caesar himself. Cortés would have known much about classical history. Cortés studied law, an education for which Latin, the language of the Romans, was a necessary prerequisite. Another scholar suggests that Cortés also read Livy. In 1519, right before Cortés was about to conquer the Aztecs, he inspired courage in the conquistadors to live up to their ancient heritage, to not only meet the deeds of the Romans, but to even surpass them. In one of his battles, Cortés even addressed his troops, saying, quote, "As for your observation, gentlemen, that the most famous Roman captains never performed deeds equal to ours, you are quite right." And so Cortés believed and portrayed himself as a neo-Roman, building a neo-Roman empire. A large part of drawing these numerous parallels to classical history was the fact that he conquered another classical people, the Aztecs. Now, the word Aztecs is a made-up word that historians and scholars made up. The people we know as the Aztecs refer to themselves as the Mexica or Mexica. And the Mexica people believed that they came from the north, from the land of seven caves, what's known as Aztlan. Linguistically, the Mexica are a Nahua people, Nahua belonging to the Uto-Aztecan language family, a language family whose speakers you could count the Utas of Utah and the Hopi of Arizona and Colorado. Over generations, the Mexica people migrated from the north all the way down to the south, where they established their own empire. When Cortés encountered this empire, he interpreted this civilization through the eyes of his own culture. For example, he referred to the indigenous American temples as mosques. And this is telling because at this time there's no Islamic anything in the American hemisphere. And in Cortés's world, Muslims were called Moors, the adjective being Moorish. And according to Cortés, the clothing of the Mexica looked Moorish. Their buildings, their architectural style, for him also looked Moorish. Now I'm going to spend the rest of the episode talking about the Spanish and the Spanish conquest. But it is really important to say that the Spanish conquest was more of a Spanish-led rebellion against Aztec rule. Or, as one historian put it, we should think of the Spanish conquest as, quote, a native civil war resulting in an incomplete Spanish domination. Now, in the episode of the Spanish conquest, the Tlaxcalans were a major ally. And to back up a bit, before the arrival of the Spanish, as the Aztec Empire expanded and grew in power, the Tlaxcalans were amongst the only people who were strong enough to resist their domination and maintain their independence. And in this regard, the Tlaxcalans were not alone. There were other indigenous American city-states which joined in a sort of Native American coalition assisting Spanish forces. And so we need to look at why the Mexica had so many enemies. Why did the Spaniards find a population who were so disgruntled with Mexica rule that they were willing to join the forces and take the side of foreign invaders? And this takes us directly to the topic of human sacrifice, a ritual which the Aztecs practiced. According to Aztec theology, they had a patron god known as Huitzilopochtli. And Huitzilopochtli was born through sacrifice. And the story goes that in the beginning there was darkness. And in this darkness, the gods gathered to create and bring forth a new universe. According to legend, all the gods died when the sun came into being. None remained who had not perished. They were living in the era of the fifth sun. And this era was brought about when the gods sacrificed themselves. And they called their modern world the fifth sun because the world had ended before. 4 times to be exact. The first sun, the second sun, the third sun, and the fourth sun. And the Aztecs believed that the world would not end a 5th time. The Aztecs were going to make sure that that was not going to happen. Now, Huitzilopochtli required nourishment, a particular kind of nourishment, derived from human blood. And this was necessary because this is the only type of nourishment Huitzilopochtli could obtain. He needed all the energy he could get to keep the 5th sun burning. He had to battle eternally against the forces of literal darkness, the night, the absence of light. And according to the Aztecs, we had a debt that needed to be repaid. Now, the Aztecs also recognized a close relationship between life and death. The gods sacrificed themselves to create us humans. They killed themselves to give us life, and we sacrifice ourselves to give life back to the gods. The gods needed to be fed. According to them, this would ward off the 5th apocalypse and ensure the survival of humanity. Through death in human sacrifice, we have life in the cosmos. This was an endless cycle, which the practice and ritual of human sacrifice reflected. But Aztec theology aside, this sort of worldview and belief system served really practical political ends. Human sacrifice effectively served to create a regime of terror, to evoke fear in their adversaries. As the Aztecs grew more and more powerful, they demanded even greater amounts of tribute, a relationship which their subjects did not appreciate. The Aztec capital was rocked by rebellions and uprisings. During the last decades before the arrival of the Europeans, human sacrifices were gaining momentum. About 30 years before the arrival, when Aztec rulers were upgrading their religious temples in the mid-15th century, they demanded a significant amount of workers to carry out this project. However, there was one community which refused. The Chalco decided enough was enough and declared open rebellion against the Aztecs. They were swiftly and brutally crushed. The captured warriors were brought to the newly finished Templo Mayor and sacrificed as a dedication. Decades later, in 1487, Aztec rulers decided to hold a great religious festival, one which would involve a great number of human sacrifices. Newly conquered city-states were voluntold to send groups of people to the capital city, to which they were slain and killed. One thing to note is that in many of these great festivals of religious sacrifice, you had representatives, dignitaries, delegates from the smaller vassal states invited to attend and watch their people being killed and sacrificed for the supposed greater good of humanity. And you could imagine the distaste, This would leave in some of their mouths to see their own people being killed for Aztec grandeur. And for their part, the Aztecs carried out these rituals with such theatrical performances that their goal was to instill fear. So when these people would go back to their smaller city-states, they would tell the stories and effectively convey the message that we do not rebel against the Aztecs. This is something we should never do. Cooperation is the best means to ensure our survival. Yet the brutality of the Aztecs would be outmatched by those claiming to be working for the service of another god who also sacrificed himself for humanity. The god of the Spanish, that is. A people who also interpreted the teachings of their god to justify an ideology of violence and warfare. Two very different crusading traditions with an obsession about the apocalypse. One trying to prevent the end of days and the other trying to actively bring them about. It is no wonder that later descendants of the Mexica would embrace Spanish culture. They would see so many parallels. And just like the Aztecs, the Spanish would also use displays of brutal violence to control local populations. Now you have a small band of Spanish conquistadors and the slaves they brought over, along with legions of Native American allies. But one thing to note is that the Spanish coalition was always outnumbered, constantly under the threat of an uprising from any of the locals. And they used a variety of means to invoke fear and terror in the people they attempted to control. They cut off hands and arms of Native American prisoners, and in some instances, by the hundreds. They killed women and would send their corpses back to their home village and smaller cities. If they wanted to make a really big scene, they would select certain individuals to be killed by being burned alive. In some instances, they had their war dogs brutally kill Native Americans in front of other Native Americans to really hammer in the point. They would also engage in collective punishment where they would take out violence and slaughter an entire village, including the women and children. Such was the case with the Cholula massacre, where Spanish and Tlaxcalan forces together slaughtered thousands of Native Americans. However, although they were brutal, the Spanish were not deliberately trying to exterminate all the local peoples. They needed the local peoples alive to enslave, to create profit. So killing all the local peoples would conflict with their goal of trying to make a lot of money in the American hemisphere. Another thing to note is that the Spanish had to rein in their brutality. They cannot be too brutal that they alienate the local populations. Keep in mind that they are always outnumbered, and they know that they depend on Native American elites to control the Native American masses. In fact, in 1528, when Cortés is making his first journey back to Spain, his first journey back from the conquest of Mexico, he brings with him on board a large delegation of Nahua nobles, including 3 sons of Moctezuma. He also had a Tlaxcalan ruler on the same ship, Don Lorenzo of Tlaxcala. And Cortés did not present these individuals as slaves, as loot before the Spanish crown. The Spanish monarchy recognized these people as dignitaries, as a sort of ambassadors. They were recognized as official envoys of another nation. That's why Cortés wanted them on his side, to legitimize all the violence and brutality, basically saying like, look, their rulers support this, so therefore this is not a bad thing what we're doing over here. And for the Spanish crown, this was extremely useful. They had big plans for Spain and its new American territories.